Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, April 16th, 2021, and today I want to look back on the 2020 United States Senate elections and talk about Donald Trump's impact on the overall Senate elections and why he almost won the Republicans the majority in the United States Senate. Had it not been for the baseless claims of election fraud in the state of Georgia, this one thing ultimately handed the Democratic Party a trifecta. And we all know that Donald Trump claiming that the election was rigged did nothing besides make Georgia blue. I mean, nothing about the results changed. The Supreme Court did not hear the case. Local courts shot it down. State legislatures shot it down. Congress shot it down. Nothing Donald Trump did really changed any type of outcome of the results except for the fact that Georgia got bluer. On top of that, I think that there is some lasting effects about Donald Trump's claims. It sets a precedent that losing candidates can claim the election was rigged, and potentially some laws can be in place to prevent vote rigging, which obviously did not exist in the 2020 election. I just think that while there will be lasting effects in terms of the laws, we do know that Donald Trump claiming the election was rigged did nothing for him. In fact, it reduced his popularity amongst the American public. So what I'm looking at here in these Senate elections is that there are a number of red states that probably could have gone blue had it not been for Donald Trump being on the top of the ticket. Donald Trump really brought some of these Republicans to victory, at least compared to expectation. There was supposed to be a few states that are red here that were supposed to go to the Democratic Party. Only a few of them ended up going blue, and some of them were widely expected to go in that direction. Let's take a look at the Senate map and talk about how his rhetoric ultimately lost the Republicans Georgia and what it can do for 2022 and why this was unprecedented that Georgia actually went to the Democratic Party rather than the Republican Party, because I think about it every day that we are now living in an environment where the Democratic Party is in a trifecta. And when I began this channel, it was the exact opposite. The Republicans were in a trifecta. We've seen a complete overhaul of the United States government here, and it's very interesting. And it did not come easy for the Democrats, but largely to blame for Donald Trump, both bringing the Democratic Party down and then propping them back up when it mattered most. But let's take a look. Based off the New York Times, they have a number of states that they consider to be states either expected to win narrowly, which I still consider to be somewhat swing states or at least competitive, and then toss-up states. So this goes from Arizona, Colorado, Michigan, Georgia, Georgia Special, Iowa, Maine, Montana, North and South Carolina, Alabama, Alaska, Kansas, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Texas. So those are all of the states that were deemed to be at least moderately competitive. Now, on the Democratic side, those Democratic states expected to win narrowly were actually more competitive than expected. For the Republican side, all of the ones in the win narrowly column were won by double digits. The closest one there was Mississippi and Texas. The rest were 11, 13, 20, and 20. So there were large margins, which I found to be very interesting. Now, the toss-up states is really where it is surprising that the Democratic Party won back control of the United States Senate. The Democratic Party only won two races out of the 7 in the toss-up column. They lost all of the ones in the Republican expected to win easily column, which makes sense, and the Republicans expected to win narrowly column. So the Democrats only needed to win 2 out of those 7 toss-up states to win the Senate majority. But there's a reason why the Senate majority is so slim, and it largely is because of Donald Trump. You see, looking at the Senate map here, we are looking at Arizona, Colorado, Michigan. These are states that should have gone to the Democratic Party, but Donald Trump made them closer. Looking at Michigan, it was decided by a closer margin than Raphael Warnock's margin in the Georgia runoff election. Gary Peters won here by 1.7%. That was because Donald Trump significantly outperformed what he was supposed to do in Michigan and nearly won the state. Well, when you take a look at Arizona, what was expected to be a Biden plus 3-4% margin ended up being less than 1 percentage point, which meant that Mark Kelly's margin, which was expected to be 6-7%, ended up only being 2.4% in this state. So it was a narrow margin, and it was much narrower than expected, but still a victory, and still pickups in Arizona and Colorado, which was a state John Hickenlooper won by around 9 points, but the margins were expected to be much larger for Gary Peters, John Hickenlooper, and Mark Kelly, and they weren't because of Donald Trump. On top of that, when you're looking at the toss-up column, I mean, the Republicans sort of ran up the numbers in some of these states. In South Carolina, which was expected to be within single digits, ended up being a double-digit victory for Lindsey Graham, despite over $100 million spent on the Democratic Party side. When you take a look at Maine, a state that was supposed to be a Democratic pickup, absolutely not a single poll had Susan Collins ahead. Susan Collins ended up winning by 8 points. When you go into the narrow amounts of Lisa Savage and other candidates on here, it's potentially, it's very possible that Sarah Gideon would have lost by around 4 points maybe, but at the end of the day, she lost, and Susan Collins got an outright majority, neglecting the ranked choice voting system altogether. So Maine went to the Republicans. Next, Montana, a state that was decided by 10 points, but was expected to be much closer. Well, you can sort of see why. A state that Donald Trump won by around 16, 17 points in the 2020 election went to the Republicans. Yes, Steve Bullock did better than Joe Biden. Steve Bullock narrowed up the margin to a point where it was almost single digits, but it was a 10-point margin, enough that it was a resounding defeat for the Democratic Party. Very hopeful, but nothing ended up happening. Alabama, a state that the Democratic Party thought they might have a surprise victory in the same way they did in 2017. Not much faith, but they thought it would be close. It wasn't close. It was decided by 20 points in favor of a Republican who had no political experience. Just looking at our Senate and breakdown and the competitive states, Donald Trump landed all of these Republicans to victory. Every single one of them. You know, with the exception of Susan Collins, I think that's the only one you can really argue. It makes sense that these Republicans won. In Alaska, won by Trump. Kansas, won by Trump. Kentucky, same thing. Mississippi, same thing. Texas, Alabama, the list goes on. Iowa, Montana, North Carolina, South Carolina. Donald Trump won in the states where the Democratic Party really needed to win if they were to win an outright Senate majority without the vice president. But they didn't get that. And looking at Georgia, the only reason why it went this way was not because of Joe Biden, not because of Kamala Harris, not because, really, of the Democratic Party, but more about Donald Trump. You see, on Election Day in November, let's go ahead and see Election Day, November 3rd, 2020, we see that Donald Trump's approval rating is hovering around 45%. Keep that in mind. The disapproval rating, 53%. A difference of 8 points. Leading into the runoffs after he continuously said the election was rigged. And keep in mind, when you're an outgoing president, your approval rating rises. Let's take a look at former President Obama. What you see here in his 8 years as he's leaving office, right around this time period, we're seeing that he's moderately popular. The election hits, and then he leaves office with a pretty high point here. Let's see if we can actually get there. 55% in terms of the overall approval. But that didn't happen for Donald Trump, because rather than concede graciously and acknowledge that he will no longer be the president of the United States, he kept claiming the election was rigged, specifically in Georgia, specifically in Arizona. But the reason why it hit so close to home in Georgia is because they had an election up. And they had 2 Republican senators that were afraid of not backing the president in his claims of election fraud. So his approval rating went from what we remember at 45% to the day of the runoffs. Let's see here. Let's go to the day of the runoffs, January 5th, 2020. It was down to 42.6%. 43% rounding. The 53% disapproval rating didn't change, but the amount of Americans that approved of him decreased. And the main thing is that it decreased from Election Day. Well, if he lost Georgia in the 2020 election, can you imagine what happens when more people dislike his party and dislike him? If he's saying that these Republican candidates will be direct reflections of him in office, are the voters who rejected him with a higher approval rating then versus now, or January 5th, when they disliked him even more? I never really understood why the Republican Party wanted to be solely Trump. And the only thing I can think of is that they thought the Democratic Party wouldn't turn out at the same rate they did in the November election. Because I think that they remember the runoff elections in Georgia. This runoff system has been in place for decades. In modern political history, the Democratic Party has never outperformed in a runoff, except for once, and it was a public commissioner race in 2002. And it was actually 2% turnout. Yes, you heard that right, 2%. So the runoff, yes, improved for the Democrats then, but we're talking about tens of races here that never improved for the Democratic Party. And the Senate election in 2008 was one of them. Let's take a look. The margin was 49.8% for Saxby Chambliss, Jim Martin at 46.8%. It should remind you a lot of the Jon Ossoff, David Perdue race, because when you look at that race, you'll see that in the first round, David Perdue got 49.7% of the vote. Jon Ossoff got 47.9% of the vote. So a difference of around 2 versus a difference of around 3. Well, the results were much more favorable for the Democratic Party, which is why it was out of the ordinary. But let me show you what happened in this runoff election, which occurred a month after the regular election in 2008. Keep in mind the Democratic Party had record-breaking turnout in 2008, 250 House seats, nearly 60 Senate seats, so there was a lot at stake in this Senate race. It was to determine whether or not the Democratic Party would have a supermajority or something that they would need to have, or essentially with the filibuster in place. That was the alternative. Either the filibuster is in place or the Democrats have a filibuster-proof majority. So both parties were vying for this seat heavily. But here's what happened. Because it was a runoff, the energy was no longer on the Democratic Party's side. It was 57 to 43. Now, there are a number of other factors that impacted this race. It's not just the fact that it was a runoff, but I think that's what the Republican Party really thought was going to happen after the 2020 election. The Democratic Party left 2020 winning the presidency, winning the House, and the Senate was just 2 Senate seats away. But the Republicans thought that voters, especially in a state like Georgia, which has had a very large and very long Republican history, would be inclined to have a checks and balance system on the president. Well, of course they did, until President Trump refused to concede the election and tied all of those Republicans to him. Because his approval rating took a dip, we saw a change in early voting statistics. This was the first warning sign for the GOP. And if you watched my channel then, you will remember me pointing this out. Black turnout increased. That is important because the most Democratic favored electorate in this entire country are black voters. Not just African American voters, but in general, black voters. That includes any type of demographic group that would be characterized as such. And looking at the other demographic groups, we saw a reduction as a result of the increase in terms of black voters in the 2020 election versus the 2021 runoffs. What was 27.7% in the early voting numbers in 2020. In the 2021 early voting numbers, you will see that it rose to 30.9%. White voters decreased from 56.5 to 55.5. And the reason why Republicans were looking at this and immediately doing is because they thought the election day turnout would be comparable or better than it was in 2020. But that wasn't the case. The warning signs were there. They refused to acknowledge them because these early voting statistics were published before the runoff elections. They could have changed their rhetoric a week out, and I can guarantee you that might have swayed the election enough that David Perdue would be in that Senate race, because that was the closest race. Decided by around 1 point, any type of change could have fundamentally shifted the balance of power in the Senate. But it was the perfect storm for the Democratic Party. And this sort of tells us that Donald Trump's influence, while beneficial when he is on the ballot, is detrimental when he's not. And you know this. If you have watched any of my other videos, I point this out. But it sort of raises the question of whether or not they truly want him for 2022. Because I think what they're trying to do, them being the Republican Party, they're trying to reflect on 2020 and repeat it. Look at what happened in Montana, analyze it, and repeat it. Or, let's say, Maine, for example. Could they win that governor's race? What happened for Susan Collins that didn't happen for other Republican nominees in Maine? Or what happened for Tom Tillis in North Carolina that didn't happen for them in the governor's race? And I think Donald Trump's influence really helped the GOP on Election Day, but proved to be the bane of their existence in the runoff elections. Looking at Georgia, it was not expected to go this way at all. Donald Trump should have realized that when he won a state by over 5 points in 2016 and then lost it in 2020, there was a coalition change. There was a shift in support. And I think the Republicans, as they did outperform him in the 2016 in the Senate versus the presidential result, because David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler and the Republicans all together in the Senate special election should have won these runoffs had everything gone to plan. They lost support. Really, just looking at the numbers, you will recognize this. There is no beating around the bush with this. David Perdue was at 49.73%. That means you just needed 0.27% of the vote to win. Jon Ossoff needed whole percentage points. At 47.95%, he needed 2.06%. So all Perdue needed was 0.27. Ossoff needed 2.06. Well, it wasn't that just Ossoff got 2.06. He did better. David Perdue saw his number decrease by around 0.4%. Ossoff saw it increase by nearly 3 points. In the special election, it gets better for the Democratic Party. The combined vote here was still putting the Republicans ahead, but the Democrats won this race by 2 points, over 2 points. Kelly Loeffler was a poor candidate. David Perdue, also arguably a poor candidate. I can guarantee you now he regrets not going to that debate against Jon Ossoff, because everything mattered in this race. But the one factor that was important above all was Donald Trump's claims of election fraud in Georgia, because this really struck with the electorate that elected him in 2016. That said, yes, it's a lesser of two evils election, but I'm going to back the Republican Party. But when you take those voters in Fulton County and surrounding Atlanta metro counties that were Trump voters in 2016 and long-lasting Republican voters, and they see the party that they used to back, and they vote for Biden in 2020, that's the first Democrat they voted for in decades. There were plenty of them in Georgia. That's how the state changed so rapidly. And they think, wow, the party I used to back vehemently is backing these claims of election fraud. When Donald Trump is saying, my vote was rigged, my swing was not there. He's arguing that the state was won in a landslide by the Republicans, but nothing indicated that because the election wasn't rigged. But then Donald Trump and the Republican Party formed this idea that it was, and you start to see the white suburban voters peel away. And you start to see an increase in minority turnout, because minorities view this as their voices trying to be silenced, that their election victory was not an election victory in the eyes of the Republican Party. And these white suburban voters that were apprehensive about the GOP, that might have voted for David Perdue on the second ballot, because that certainly did happen, they changed their minds in the runoffs because Perdue and Loeffler went full Trump. And I never understood it. I don't think any of you guys understood why. The only thing I can sort of see is if they were counting on the Democrats not to have high turnout, but they haven't seen the hatred of a president before they saw it for President Trump in modern history. I mean, yes, we saw a higher disapproval rating for George W. Bush, a much stronger base for Donald Trump, but amongst the Democratic Party, they were willing to work with Bush. They were certainly not willing to work with Donald Trump. And there's one person that they continue to bring up, and it's not Bush, it's Donald Trump to this day. And I think that will last for potentially through 2024 and beyond. So Georgia, a state that went blue in 2020, went blue in 2021, but honestly, had the circumstances been different, we probably would be in a position where there would be a Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, and the Republicans would be in the majority. While Donald Trump had positive effects immediately, he proved to be detrimental in the long run. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my post-2020 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.